exciting year for agricultural policy in 2018, and 2019 is promising to be pretty exciting as well. Go ahead and get ready. So today what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of an overview of how we got to where we are right now. A little bit of my conjecture in reading the Farm Bill on what some of those programs might be. Oh, hey, there we go. And then we're going to talk just at the end a little bit about trade, because this really all ties in together. As we came into 2019, there was a lot of uncertainty around what markets might do, what profitability might be as a result of that. The Farm Bill provided some certainty in that atmosphere in terms of just having some knowledge of what programs were going to change in big ways, but we don't have a lot of the details yet. Trade is still a big source of uncertainty in our market right now. And so we're going to touch on that just a little bit, but we're going to start out just talking about the Farm Bill to begin. Now, to go back in 2018, this was actually quite a fast-moving Farm Bill, particularly when compared to the 2014 Farm Bill. You might remember how long it took to get a Farm Bill at that time. Last year, the Farm Bill was first introduced by the House Ag Committee in April. It failed to pass the first time it went up, but it passed on June 21st. The Senate passed their version of the bill on June 28th. Then in July and August, respectively, there was a vote to send those two versions to conference committee in order to reconcile those differences so that we could have a final Farm Bill language. That report was signed December 10th, coming right in before we started to get in some of those impacts of having an expired 2014 Farm Bill. It went for a full Senate floor vote on December 11th and passed 87-13, and then a full House floor vote on December 12th and passed 369-47. Now, you look at those numbers. That is a strong support for this Farm Bill, particularly if you compare it to any other bill that has gone up in the last year. It was signed by the White House December 20th, and signed into law. Now, at that point, the next step would be interpretation and program guidance. USDA then reads this law, it interprets it, and it creates the actual details of how this is going to be implemented. December 28th, the shutdown happened. And so that went all the way through, went a 35-day shutdown, and so now USDA is really just getting back in. They've got to get through the backlog of things they weren't able to do during that shutdown before getting back to implementation of the Farm Bill. Now, there is some good news in this particular Farm Bill in that it is evolutionary but not revolutionary. There's not a lot of new programs. There's not a lot of huge changes in this Farm Bill, and so that should ease some of that burden. But nevertheless, it's probably going to push us back on some of those deadlines. So let's just talk briefly. You know, the Farm Bill is still a 12-title Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill, is, if you're not familiar with it, I just want to step back for a moment and take a higher level view. The Farm Bill is an omnibus bill, which means we pack a lot of programs within a single piece of legislation that's passed once every 5 years. It contains both the authorization to actually have these programs in place, and in some cases it also includes the money, the spending authority to implement some of these programs. But it isn't the same for every one of these programs within the Farm Bill. So you'll hear different things related to different programs about the impact of changes in this Farm Bill. I'm not going to be able to hit on every one of these today. We just don't quite have the time, unless you guys want to hang out and make a working lunch and listen to me all the way through lunch. I don't think you do. So we're just going to hit on some of the highlights. If I don't hit on something that you guys are really interested in, please feel free to ask the question. I may not be able to answer it, but I can certainly get your contact information and get back in touch with you with an answer. So this Farm Bill is a baseline Farm Bill. That means it's about the same pot of money that we had in the last Farm Bill. So if you think about it in terms of how that money is distributed across the pie, that $867 billion, about 75% of it in this Farm Bill lives here in the nutrition title. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. The other big three in the Farm Bill are crop insurance, the commodity title, which is where ARC and PLC are, and the conservation title. The other 1% lives in trade, credit, rural infrastructure and development, research, extension, forestry, energy, horticulture, and miscellaneous. We're going to touch on a few of the important changes that were in some of these other titles, because just because it's not a lot of money, don't be fooled that these are not important titles in this Farm Bill as well. All right, so let's touch a little bit on the commodity title. Eligibility and limits, a lot of proposed changes that were in particularly the House and the Senate versions of the Farm Bill related to this. But the end result that came out of the conference committee didn't have a lot of huge changes in terms of eligibility. It did expand the family definition to include nieces, nephews, and first cousins as compared to what we had before. And also the sequestration was changed so it's applied before the payment limitation. So what does that mean practically speaking? Let's say you hit your $125,000 limit. Before 6 to 7% would be taken off of that $125,000. Well, maybe your payments would have been $150,000, you hit your cap. Now they're going to take the sequestration off of the $150,000, not your $125,000, which would get you closer to your full amount that you would receive under that cap. All right, election. This is where we got some benefit in terms of added flexibility around the election. You'll still elect to ARC or PLC, but in this time around, you're going to elect to 19 and 20, but then in 21, 22, and 23, you could change that election if you chose to do so. It's not a requirement, it's not something you have to do. It would be up to you if you wanted to do that. And then I also just want to say, as we come into this time later on in this year, when we're starting to think about these decisions and what you might elect to in 19 and 20, Oklahoma State and Kansas State University will once again be working together to have a decision tool available. And so that will roll out as we get closer to the election period, which we don't know exactly when that election period is going to be yet. So, but we're trying to stay ahead of the curve. You know, there's some data that needs to come out before we can really finalize this tool. No base acre update in this Farm Bill. So here you can see this is sort of the distribution of base acres by county from the last Farm Bill. The difference here though from what I have up here is this does include generic base acres. So that was broken into the seed cotton unassigned and other kinds of base acres. And so I need to wait for that base acre file to come out to really be able to update this. But there was some discussion in this Farm Bill, are we going to have a base acre update or not? The end result in the conference report was not. So however your base acres were reallocated after you finished that update in December for your seed cotton, if you were a part of that, that's the base acres you'll be looking at under this Farm Bill. Yield updates. So particularly if you're interested, I think there's a lot of interest in PLC this time around. So particularly if you're interested in PLC, there is an option for anyone in the country to be able to update their yields, a one-time yield update. And we'll talk specifically about what's going to happen there, but a few important points. One is this wouldn't be effective until the 2020 crop year. That was kind of a cost savings measure that went into place by delaying it by a year. Another thing is that, I think there are some counties where this yield update is going to make sense, and there's some counties where it's not. And we can talk about this a little bit as we get into how the actual calculation works. So the calculation for this yield update is going to be 20% of the average yield per planted acre from 13 to 17. But unlike previous yield updates, now it's going to be multiplied by this yield update factor. And this is a ratio of the 2008 to 2012 national average yield and the 2013 to 2017 national average yield. It's capped between two numbers. It can't be lower than 0.9. It can't be higher than 1.0. So let's think about this then for a wheat example. So if your wheat yield per planted acre from 13 to 17 is 35 bushels per acre, and then your PLC yield is going to be 90% of the 35 bushels per acre times, I don't know, there we go, times your yield adjustment factor of 0.9767, which is based on that ratio. So that's kind of how this yield update is going to work. Just some preliminary look for a few commodities. This is going to work in some counties and it's not going to work in others, but it is optional. If your previous yield is actually more beneficial to you, then you can leave it alone. All right, another thing is the effective reference prices. So reference prices did not change from the 2014 Farm Bill. The reference prices you were used to seeing previously, those are still there. But now they've made this change that if prices go, if you have 5-year rolling Olympic average, which means you drop out the high year, you drop out the low year, of your marketing year average prices, if you take 85% of that 5-year average, and that's higher than the reference price, then it will switch over to what it's calling this effective reference price. But it can't go higher than 115% of the reference price. So, okay, well, again, let's just take an example here so we can kind of see. So reference price for wheat is still going to be $5.50. The maximum effective reference price is going to be $6.33. That's 115% of the $5.50. And then if you take this rolling Olympic average marketing year average price, and you take 85% of that, then you get $4.33. So what does this just mean? If this was the 2019 numbers for wheat, and I think these need to be updated, then what this would tell you is that you're going to take the reference price in your PLC calculation in that year, and that's going to change every year for each commodity. So, you know, just looking at prices, do I really think we're going to trigger any of these effective reference prices anytime too soon? Probably not for a lot of our commodities, simply because even if we had a high price year, it's going to drop out in that Olympic average. And so we're still going to have some lower prices in that average. Okay, so ARC. If you're interested in ARC, there were some changes that were made in this program. The first is that the plug yield increased from 70 to 80%, if you remember how that plug yield fits in whenever you have a low yield year. Another thing is the same effective reference price that we had just talked about is going to be factored into that benchmark revenue this time around. They're going to do a trend adjustment on the yields, and there's not a lot of details yet what that trend adjustment is going to look like, so we're just going to have to wait and see what the details are on that. Also, there's this change where they're going to split very large counties, so counties with more than 4,000 square miles and more than 190,000 base acres. They're potentially going to split that into multiple ARC payment areas. Particularly, though, I think they're going to be looking for counties that have some different soil types or some different climate factors within those counties. I'm not sure our 3 counties we have in Oklahoma that are that big may fall into this, but we'll see. It's just something to be aware of. And finally, there's going to be a prioritization of the RMA data, the crop insurance data, for use in these calculations. And finally, dry land and irrigated guarantees. They're going to split these out for counties that have sufficient irrigated acreages to actually have a dry land number and an irrigated number. And so that's going to be another change that we'll see in the ARC. And there's going to be no more combined counties either in the ARC payment calculations. Okay, so now we're going to go into this land and grass, which I think a lot of people are interested in this. They have a lot of questions associated with this change that was made. So first, just some of the facts in terms of my reading of the Farm Bill. Again, this is all based on my reading of the Farm Bill, and I have a lot of questions around this one as well, and in what is actually going to change. So farms, and here we're talking about a farm under an FSA number, that have had no acres in a covered commodity, but have been planted entirely to grass from 2009 to 2017, will not be eligible to re-enroll those base acres in ARC or PLC for the coming Farm Bill. Instead, they'll be eligible for a new grassland program, which comes at a rate of $18 per acre. And here in this map, you can kind of see this is all of the land that, and these are 30 meter by 30 meter little pixels that we have in grass in Oklahoma. Now, not all those acres have base on them, but certainly I think this is something that has the potential to have a big impact on us here in Oklahoma. This is a voluntary program. It should be relatively easy to sign up for based on what I have heard so far. It's still working land. You can have cattle out on it. You don't have to keep it in grass for the entire time frame from what the initial reading of that Farm Bill looks like. It is funded, it's going to be funded under CSP funds, but it's separate is what it sounds like from other CSP programs. And so sort of the requirements and things that are associated with CSP, this would be a separate program from what it sounds like. So again, we're waiting on details. It's going to have its own payment limits. It's going to have its own eligibility. All of those things are still going to apply to it. But we're waiting to hear the details on exactly how this program in particular is going to work out. And there's a lot of folks that have a lot of questions about this program. Okay, so marketing loans, the final thing in the commodities title that I want to say, and I am spending a little bit more time on the commodities title than I'm going to spend on some of the others, is that some of the marketing loan rates have increased for 2019 to 2023, but not for every commodity. For example, cotton did not increase in this Farm Bill compared to what it was before. And then those, of course, are going to factor into those ARC and PLC payments as well. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about some of the changes in livestock. The livestock forage program is a very well-used program in Oklahoma, protecting against whenever you get weather-related damage to your grass that affects your ability to graze your cattle on it. That program was maintained in this Farm Bill with very minimal changes. And then there was also an expansion of the livestock indemnity program to include unweaned livestock, which weren't covered previously. And bear in mind that there's some combined changes here. If you're familiar with some of the changes in the Bipartisan Budget Act associated with LIP and ELAP, the Bipartisan Budget Act actually pulled the cap off of the LIP program, so it wasn't subject to a $125,000 cap. And then the Farm Bill did the same thing with the ELAP program. Basically, the idea is if you're a rather large-scale producer and you experience a major disaster, be it a hurricane or a wildfire that does major damage on your herd, maybe you're a stocker producer or you're a cow-calf producer and you've got cows and calves on the ground when the event happens, you can hit that $125,000 cap pretty quickly. And so this actually makes it so that you could be all of your livestock could be indemnified that were lost in that event. One of the big changes for livestock in this Farm Bill that doesn't have as much impact on us here in Oklahoma as it would for other states was that the Dairy Margin Coverage Program will replace the Margin Protection Program coverage for dairy producers. And there's a lot of changes that happened here, but just some broad brushstrokes for your awareness is there were some incentives for large producers to buy revenue insurance under this restructuring of this program. Also, they're going to refund some of the premiums. So actually more money was paid into the MPP than what was actually paid out to producers. And so they're going to make some mechanisms for people to get some of that money back that they put in. And particularly if you're going to buy your coverage for the future under the DMC program, then they'll give you actually 75% of your premiums back. And so it could make this coverage pretty cheap for the coming years for some of our dairy producers if they fit into this. And then finally, in emergency response, there were three main programs that were funded for sort of national scale emergency response and preparedness. The first is this Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program, which is going to help build up the capacity to respond to major animal health events. You can think about foot and mouth disease, highly pathogenic avian influenza, African swine fever has been in the news a lot lately. And then also establishing a U.S.-only vaccine bank that would begin with foot and mouth disease vaccine. We are currently a member of the North American Foot and Mouth Disease Vaccine Bank, but this would be a vaccine bank that was specifically for U.S. usage. And then finally, expanding support to the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, which is your state lab and kind of your first line of defense for doing testing related to foreign animal diseases. All right, now let's talk a little bit about conservation. There weren't a lot of changes in the conservation title, but we can talk a little bit about what was there. The first is that the CRP acreage cap increased to 27 million acres. However, this is slightly offset against the fact that they reduced the rental rates for CRP acres. So it went from 100% of the county average to 90% for continuous enrollment and then 85% for general enrollment. And so there's going to be, particularly for people who have some land rolling out of CRP and they might have some decisions coming to them in this next year, we're going to be looking for more information on exactly how this offset is going to affect us on these CRP acres. Then in the Working Lands program, there was a lot of discussion around the Working Lands program, particularly around CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. But at the end of the day, both EQIP and CSP will still be with us for another 5 years. The EQIP program's funding was actually increased, whereas the CSP's funding was decreased for this time frame. There was a reduction in the livestock producer set aside under EQIP from 60% to 50%. And then there was also going to be some funds in the CSP that are going to be diverted over to this grassland program. I have a big question of how many acres are we going to have that really sign up under this grassland program, and what is that going to mean for this CSP budget, given there was a reduction in the overall budget in this new program that was added to it. So I definitely have some questions related to that program and the funding in it. Now, why did they move some of these funds around? Well, some of it was so that they could move money into some other programs. So there was some expanded support for the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and then also for the easement programs as well. And so this is just a breakdown of the expected outlays associated with the conservation title in some of these different programs. And you can still see here the CSP is still pretty, and EQIP are still pretty big users of those funds nationally. Okay, so let's talk just briefly. We're going to talk about trade here at the end, but briefly, just to highlight some of the changes, is that in the trade title, there was a combining of some programs you might have heard about or be familiar with. MAP, FMDP, not to be confused with foot and mouth disease in the vaccine bank that we just talked about, the Emerging Markets Program, and the Technical Assistance for Specialty Crops Program are going to be combined under a single heading, but they'll still have individual program rules associated with them. Also, nutrition, a lot of discussion around nutrition during the conference committee and exactly what changes would be made in terms of mandatory working requirements. The final changes to this farm bill looked a lot more like the Senate version of the proposed changes in the nutrition title. There was some support for existing work requirements and encouraging those work requirements, promotion of healthy food consumption and fresh fruits and vegetables, and also efforts to reduce program abuse were included in the nutrition title that actually came out of the conference committee. Then in credit, we had a few questions around this, so I thought I would go ahead and put this up. There were some changes in the FSA loan amounts in the Farm Bill. So particularly like this direct operating and farm ownership loans went up to $400,000 for operating loans and $600,000 for ownership loans. So that's a change in this Farm Bill that you'll be able to talk to your FSA county agent about. And then we're continuing some of the investments in the rural development title. Specifically, if you've been familiar with some of the efforts that have been made around rural broadband, those will be continuing under this Farm Bill. Also some money being put into rural opioid crisis and also mental health issues in rural America, and some investments in infrastructure. We're talking about schools, hospitals, things like that out of this Farm Bill. Now, the crop insurance title, you might think, well, why did she leave the crop insurance title this far in her presentation? That's an important title. It was one of the big four, right? Well, it's because there just weren't a lot of changes to the crop insurance title in this farm bill. Back in the listening sessions, producers and groups came back and said, do no harm to crop insurance. It's working for us. And legislators listened. And so there were very few changes in the crop insurance title of the Farm Bill. There are a provision for dual policies for grazing and grain. And what that's going to mean, exactly how that's going to work, we have yet to see, but something to kind of watch out for, particularly if you're like a winter wheat stalker producer. And it's also clarifying the use of cover crops as good farming practices. Again, we'll just wait and see how those rules kind of come out and are implemented. Some changes to whole farm revenue protection, which wasn't a particularly well-used program here in Oklahoma, but specifically changes for new and beginning producers who might want to utilize that program. And then finally, there was an authorization for hemp as a covered commodity and an ability to cover that as crop insurance. And we'll talk about that in just a moment whenever we talk about the horticulture title. And here we are, the horticulture title. Usually we don't get to talk about the horticulture title very much, but this time the horticulture title is where industrial hemp was put in as an agricultural commodity. So hemp has been removed from the list of controlled substances, where hemp has a very specific definition of having THC levels less than 0.3%. Other cannabis remain on the controlled substances list. This is a very specific exemption that has been put in place for hemp. Also, states and tribal nations will need to put together their plans for monitoring, testing, and enforcing the penalties around hemp production. And those will need to be approved by USDA before being implemented. So it's very important to realize that Oklahoma has a pilot program right now. Those are the rules that are still in place. So until, this whole process, we go through this whole process associated with this, and we have some sort of new rules in Oklahoma, the rules are still associated with that pilot program. And just to that point, if you have any questions about the pilot program, you can contact Sarah Wallace to get more information. And that's basically, it's just we're still under the pilot program until you hear something differently, and I anticipate it would be quite some time before all of these changes could go into place for Oklahoma. So where do we come here at the end? We talked about we have a baseline farm bill. It's about the same pot of money as what we had before. So what does that mean for these little changes that were made? Well, if you want to make a piece of the pie bigger, you got to make a piece of the pie smaller when your pie size doesn't change. And that's really what we're talking about in this farm bill. We're talking about changes were made to shift money around to fund certain initiatives. And so that's really what this shows. As you can see, some of the changes. This is, for example, the yield increase offset slightly by the land and grass. These are the increases in trade promotion. These are some changes for the forestry title in terms of brush management and forest health. We got this change in crop insurance in terms of being able to use policies a little more effectively. This miscellaneous title, a large portion of that are these changes associated with emergency health. And this is a savings program. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about an $879 billion farm bill, and these bars are in millions. So, the bars aren't as big percentage-wise as they might look here. But in total, you pretty much have a farm bill with the same kind of spending as the last farm bill that we had. Final thoughts, final wrap up on the farm bill before we talk just maybe 5-10 minutes about trade is that the 2018 farm bill is evolutionary. It is not revolutionary. Not a lot of big changes. We're just evolving and refining some of the programs that were put in place in the 14 farm bill and earlier. I heard one of my colleagues refer to this as sprinkles on the cake. It's the same birthday cake you had last year, but you get more sprinkles this year. Also, there's some technical changes and some added flexibility. This may mean more decision making as you go along through the year, which isn't always easy when you're trying to make other decisions as well, but it does give you some flexibility in your decision making. Next step is implementation. I do think the shutdown is going to have some impact on the timeline of that implementation for some programs, maybe not for all. Particularly some of the ones that were very small changes or had no changes. Remember, we had a lot of programs that were continued, were just maintained with no changes in this farm bill. So those you can expect to see rolling along on pretty normal timelines, even with the shutdown. But some, particularly our new programs that we're really looking for some guidance on, let's just have some patience as they get the guidelines out on those programs. This has been an interesting year for trade policy. We have had some excitement out there. It's always a little exciting in the trade space, but trade continues to be a really important market for U.S. Products. We produce more than we can really consume in terms of agricultural products here in the United States. And so that's why these international markets have continued to grow in importance. That's new market share that can allow us to sell that product without driving down our domestic prices. And historically speaking, different kinds of trade agreements have created opportunities for U.S. products because the whole purpose of a trade agreement is to give you some preferential treatment with an individual country or with a group of countries. And keep in mind, some of these are bilateral trade agreements where it's just one country agreeing with another country. Some of them are multilateral agreements where a whole group of countries are coming together. But generally speaking, the U.S. has been good about getting involved in beneficial trade agreements to open new markets for U.S. products. But we've had a lot of uncertainty introduced in the last year associated with U.S. trade. So specifically the trade talks with China that are ongoing right now that are hopefully going to lead to avoidance of further tariffs being placed on agricultural goods coming out of the U.S. A tariff is in essence a tax. So we definitely don't want them. We want them to come off soon. We want these issues to be resolved so that we can have our free and open markets for our agricultural product without making them more costly in the world market by adding a tariff on the top of them. There's no resolution as of this week to the talks that are ongoing. We have until March 1st before the next round of tariffs go in place. China is buying agricultural goods as part of that agreement that was reached in December while we wait for some of these talks to go on. Again, we've got a March 1st deadline or else we're going to have an increase in some of these tariffs for an additional $200 billion worth of Chinese imports into the U.S. The sticking point continues to be this intellectual property rights issue. And, the U.S. is a major developer of new intellectual property, of patents, of technologies. That's one of our strengths in the world market. And so that has value for us. Those things are valuable to us. Talks continue on through the rest of this week and through the rest of March with some hope that we would have some sort of resolution or at least some continued agreement to buy U.S. products going into the future. This is going to continue to be a sticky point well into the future. I don't think we are terribly close to a resolution on this. It doesn't necessarily mean we won't have some sort of additional interim agreements until we get some sort of resolution one way or the other. But I would say, I'm not expecting any sort of big revolutionary kind of an announcements in the next month. And Trump has even said that he may extend the deadline of March 1st, depending on how these talks are going at that time. So this is another wait and see kind of situation that we find ourselves in with trade. So why is it so important, these retaliatory tariffs and the conversations we're having around this? These are the U.S. exports to our top 3 markets. Our top 3 markets are Canada, Mexico, and China. for agricultural goods right now. And so you can see there has been some change. This is mostly driven by the economy in China. They have had some challenges in their economy in recent years that has changed agricultural goods in the U.S. It's also had to do with some other countries that have pursued either closer bilateral agreements with China or have received some sort of preferential status for shipping product into those markets. But you can see that even though this line has gone down as compared to where it was in 2013, 2014, whereas Canada and Mexico really continue to be our steady trade partners of those top three, China still plays an important role in agricultural exports for the United States. And what are some of those exports? Why is it so important? You know, some of these tariffs that originally went on are associated with steel and aluminum. So you might be saying, well, why soybeans? Why beef? Why pork? Well, it's because that's primarily agricultural products are a big chunk of what we are exporting to these countries because we do have a relative advantage in agricultural production in the U.S. We are very efficient in agricultural production. You guys do a good job. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. You do a good job of producing these products. So bottom line, sort of how to kind of wrap it up and how these trade-offs might look. The benefits we see here is that some steel and aluminum companies are going to benefit from having these tariffs on steel and aluminum products coming into the United States. It makes the U.S. product relatively less expensive. There's also going to be some federal revenue that comes from these tariffs that are in essence a tax on these products that come out of these tariffs, but there's also some potential for losses. Our consumers, as production manufacturing is done in the U.S. with more expensive inputs, some of that's going to be passed through to consumers. Also, import-related American workers who work at docks or some shipping companies, there might be some stress on those industries. In the U.S., processing companies who rely on some of these inputs that have tariffs associated with them may see some impacts from this. Importing and exporting countries, this is causing shifts in trade flows all around the world. This is not just limited to the U.S. and China. The entire world is shifting around trade flows in relation to this. And then also farmers. Now, I will back up just a moment and talk about these 2 points together. You may actually see that the exports in terms of volume from the United States don't go down or maybe even go up. Why? Because as our product gets more affordable, we can break into other countries that we maybe weren't in before. So you may just be seeing in terms of total trade volume, you may see some shift of U.S. product into other markets it wasn't in before. So I think that's important to bear in mind when you're looking at trade totals across the year, is that we're having this shifting. Industry is very creative. They're going to find a home for that product. But China is still a very important market for us because there's a lot of people there that are hungry. All right, trade wrap up. Only time will tell what the final impact of this trade negotiation process that's happening right now is going to be. But I will say that the longer these trade disputes drag out, the more the damages will accrue and the more benefits we will need to see from the process in order to outweigh those damages that are being incurred. Also, just as a policy point associated with trade, as of right now, there is no indication that there will be another market facilitation program payment on the 2019 crop. President Trump has said that or maybe it was Secretary Perdue, has said that there is no intention of having another MFP payment in 2019. So time will tell what actually happens there, but I do think that's an important point, that was really intended to be a one-time, one-shot program. So with that, I covered a lot of ground. Everybody's hungry. They're a little stunned at what I don't know at this point, and it's a lot. But, you know, Will Rogers said an economist's guess is as good as anybody else's. So these are my guesses. I think that's a really good question. You know, we have had a lot of conversation around budget reduction, reducing overall spending and support programs. That has kind of died off a little bit in the recent year, so there's a good chance they might find some additional money in the budget. You know, it's, for example, the MFP, they really found that out of USDA's budget. USDA kind of took that money out of their own hide, so to speak, in order to have that program happen. So yes, they have to find the money from somewhere. They either have to be willing to take on the additional debt to fund that program, or they have to shift some money around. It wouldn't be Farm Bill money. Most of our Farm Bill money is really fixed on specific programs, but particularly within appropriations bills, that might be where they would find that additional money if they were going to find any additional money. But as you said, it's not really a hugely receptive environment to additional spending right now. Yeah, that's a really good point that I didn't bring up, is that we are flirting with the WTO limits that could lead to some challenges at the international level at the amount of subsidization that's being provided. Part of the reason the payments in the MFP were set the way they were was in order to avoid those limits on how much just sort of direct subsidization can be provided. So that's something that would definitely need to be considered that aspect is something that would need to be considered very carefully going forward, that we didn't push ourselves over into a place where we're taking on another lawsuit from other countries.